Loyalty and Longevity, Part 2. From heiress presumptive to queen. Elizabeth and Philip had been scheduled to leave for a state visit to Canada and the United States, which they postponed by 2 weeks until they were reassured that her father was in no imminent danger. They departed at midnight on October 8, 1951, and arrived 16 hours later in Montreal, the beginning of a 35-day trek of more than 10,000 miles to the Pacific and back. The essential public routine that the royal couple would use over the decades took shape in those long days. Elizabeth was the restrained presence, her smiles tentative and infrequent, which prompted criticism in some press accounts. "My face is aching with smiling," she complained to Martin Charteris when she heard the reports on her dour demeanor. Philip, always at a discreet distance behind, was already providing comic relief. Once, he went over the line, committing the first of his famous gaffes when he jokingly observed that Canada was a good investment, a remark that stuck in the Canadians' craw for its neo-imperial implication. The scope and pace of the trip were punishing. They made more than 70 stops, and on a single day in Ontario they visited 8 towns. Through it all, Elizabeth worried about the health of her father. Philip tried to keep the atmosphere light, but he clearly found the journey stressful. He was impatient. He was restless, recalled Martin Charteris. He hadn't yet defined his role. He was certainly very impatient with the old-style courtiers and sometimes, I think, felt that the princess paid more attention to them than to him. He didn't like that. If he called her a bloody fool now and again, it was just his way. I think others would have found it more shocking than she did. For much of the trip, Philip wore his naval uniform, and Elizabeth favored discreetly tailored suits and close-fitting hats, as well as fur coats and capes. During their visit to Niagara Falls, they had to wear oilskin suits on the spray-lashed observation deck. Pulling her hood tight, Elizabeth exclaimed, "This will ruin my hair." Several weeks later, the royal couple boarded a plane for Washington and set foot on American soil for the first time on October 31. President Harry S. Truman observed that his daughter, Margaret, who had met the princess during a visit to England, tells me when everyone becomes acquainted with you, they immediately fall in love with you. The 67-year-old president counted himself among them, calling Elizabeth a fairy princess. Elizabeth enunciated every word of her reply, her high voice a model of cut-glass precision, proclaiming that free men everywhere look towards the United States with affection and with hope. At a rose garden ceremony, the royal couple presented the Trumans with a mirror adorned with a painting of flowers, to be hung in the refurbished Blue Room as a welcome ornament, a mark of our friendship. Their visit ended with a white-tie dinner in honor of the Trumans at the Canadian Embassy. They had a rough return trip across the North Atlantic aboard the Empress of Scotland. Only Elizabeth managed to avoid seasickness and show up regularly at mealtimes, and veteran sailor Philip was furious about his own weakness. On arrival at the Liverpool dockyards 3 days after Prince Charles's 3rd birthday, they boarded the royal train for London's Euston Station. Waiting on the platform were Queen Elizabeth, Princess Margaret, and Prince Charles, who had not seen his parents in more than a month. When the princess and duke stepped off the train, Elizabeth rushed to hug her mother and kiss her on both cheeks. For tiny Charles, she simply leaned down and gave him a peck on the top of his head before turning to kiss Margaret. "Britain's heiress presumptive puts her duty first," explained a newsreel announcer. "Motherly love must await the privacy of Clarence House." Prince Philip was even less demonstrative, touching his son on the shoulder to indicate they should move along to the waiting limousines. As they passed through the station, Prince Charles was again with his grandmother, while his parents walked ahead. After Christmas, the ailing king deputed Elizabeth and Philip to represent him on a long-planned 6-month tour of Australia, New Zealand, and Ceylon. The couple decided to add several days in the beginning of the trip to visit the British colony of Kenya, which had given them a retreat at the foot of Mount Kenya called Sagana Lodge as a wedding gift. After settling into the lodge, Elizabeth and Philip spent a night at Treetops Hotel, a 3-bedroom cabin built among the branches of a large fig tree above an illuminated salt lick in a game preserve. Dressed in khaki trousers and a bush scarf, Elizabeth excitedly filmed the animals with her movie camera. At sunset, she and Philip spotted a herd of 30 elephants. "Look, Philip, they're pink," she said, not realizing that the grey pachyderms had been rolling in pink dust. Back at Saginaw on the morning of February 6, the princess's aides learned that the 56-year-old king had died from a blood clot in his heart. Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary was now queen, at age 25. When Philip was told, he muttered that it would be the most appalling shock for his wife, then walked into her bedroom and broke the news to her. She shed no tears, but looked pale and worried. "What are you going to call yourself?" asked Martin Charteris as Elizabeth came to grips with the loss of her father. "My own name, of course." "What else?" she replied. But some clarification was necessary, since her mother had been called Queen Elizabeth. The new monarch would be Queen Elizabeth II, following her 16th-century predecessor, Elizabeth I, but she would be known as the Queen. Her mother would become Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, rather than the fusty or Dowager Queen. Elizabeth II would be Queen Regnant, and her royal cipher E2R. It was all very sudden, she recalled 4 decades later. Her task, she said, was kind of taking it on, and making the best job you can. It's a question of maturing into something that one's got used to doing, and accepting the fact that here you are, and it's your fate, because I think continuity is important. Dressed in a simple black coat and hat, she held her composure as she arrived at the airport in London near dusk on February 7, 1952, after a 19-hour flight. Waiting on the tarmac was a small delegation led by her uncle the Duke of Gloucester and Prime Minister Winston Churchill. She slowly shook hands with each of them, and they gave her deep bows. A Daimler bearing the sovereign's coat of arms on its roof drove her to Clarence House, where 84-year-old Queen Mary honored her by reversing roles, curtsying, and kissing her hand, although she couldn't help adding, "Lilibet, your skirts are much too short for mourning." The next day, the new queen went to St. James's Palace, where she appeared for 20 minutes before several hundred members of the Accession Council, a ceremonial body including the Privy Council, the principal advisory group to the monarch, drawn from senior ranks of politicians, the clergy, and the judiciary, along with other prominent officials from Britain and the Commonwealth. She had been monarch since the moment of her father's death, but the council was convened to hear her proclamation and religious oath. She would not be crowned until her coronation, in 16 months, but she was fully empowered to carry out her duties as sovereign. The men of the council bowed to the 40th monarch since William the Conqueror took the English throne after the Battle of Hastings, in 1066. Elizabeth II declared in a clear voice that by the sudden death of my dear father, I am called to assume the duties and responsibilities of sovereignty. My heart is too full for me to say more to you today than I shall always work, as my father did throughout his reign, to advance the happiness and prosperity of my peoples, spread as they are the world over. I pray that God will help me to discharge worthily this heavy task that has been lain upon me so early in my life." As her husband escorted her out, she was in tears. By April, the royal family had moved to Buckingham Palace, and the new queen adapted to an office schedule that has scarcely varied throughout her reign. Adjusting to his position as the queen's consort proved troublesome for Philip. "For a real action man, that was very hard to begin with," said Patricia Brabourne. While everything was mapped out for Elizabeth II, he had to invent his job under the scrutiny of her courtiers, and he had no role model to follow. Prince Philip was still considered an outsider by some senior officials of the court. "Refugee husband," he mockingly referred to himself. Philip was constantly being squashed, snubbed, ticked off, rapped over the knuckles, said John Brabourne. Much of the wariness stemmed from Philip's closeness to Dickie Mountbatten. "My father was considered pink very progressive," Patricia Brabourne recalled. The worry was that Prince Philip would bring into court modern ideas and make people uncomfortable. The consort's role. The most hurtful rebuff had occurred in the days following the king's death, After Queen Mary heard that Dicky Mountbatten had triumphantly announced that the House of Mountbatten now reigned, she and her daughter-in-law the Queen Mother were angered by his presumption, and the Queen shared their view that she should honor the allegiance of her grandfather and her father to the House of Windsor by keeping the Windsor name rather than taking that of her husband. Churchill and his cabinet agreed. Philip responded with a memo to Churchill vigorously objecting to the Prime Minister's advice and pressing instead for the House of Mountbatten, which was ironic. It was his mother's family name, since his father had given him no surname. The Queen failed to foresee that her actions would have a profound impact on Philip, leading to strains in their marriage. She was very young, said Patricia Brabourne. Churchill was elderly and experienced, and she accepted his constitutional advice. I felt that if it had been later she would have been able to say, "I don't agree. I am the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his children," Philip fumed to friends. "I'm nothing but a bloody amoeba." Dicky Mountbatten was even more outspoken, blaming that old drunk Churchill who forced the Queen's position. The Prime Minister mistrusted and resented Earl Mountbatten, largely because as India's last viceroy, appointed by Prime Minister Clement Attlee, he had presided over that country's move to independence. "Churchill never forgave my father for giving away India," said Patricia Brabourne. Behind the scenes, Dicky continued a campaign to reverse the decision, with his nephew's acquiescence. Meanwhile, Philip resolved to support his wife while finding his own niche, which would lead in the following decades to the active patronage of more than 800 different charities embracing sports, youth, wildlife conservation, education, and environmental causes. Within the family, Philip also took over management of all the royal estates, to save her a lot of time, he said. But even more significantly, as Prince Charles's official biographer Jonathan Dimbleby wrote in 1994, the Queen would submit entirely to the father's will in decisions concerning their children. She made Philip the ultimate domestic arbiter, Dimbleby wrote, because she was not indifferent so much as detached. Newspaper editor and conservative politician William Deed saw in Elizabeth's detachment her struggle to be a worthy head of state, which was a heavy burden for her. The Queen in her own quiet way is immensely kind, but she had too little time to fulfill her family care. I find it totally understandable, but it led to problems. Following her coronation, on June 2, 1953, the Queen turned her full attention to an ambitious 5.5-month world tour covering 43,000 miles, from Bermuda to the Cocos Islands, by plane and ship. It was her first extended trip as sovereign, and the first time a British monarch had circled the globe. 5-year-old Prince Charles and 3-year-old Princess Anne spoke to the Queen and Prince Philip by radio telephone, but otherwise news of their progress came in regular letters from the Queen Mother, who had them for weekends at Royal Lodge, her house in Windsor Great Park. Just as Elizabeth and Margaret had followed their parents' travels on maps, Prince Charles traced his parents' route on a globe in his nursery. The crowds everywhere were enormous and enthusiastic. Masses of welcoming boats jammed Sydney Harbour, and by one count, 3/4 of Australia's population came out to see the Queen. At age 27 she was hailed as the world's sweetheart. But the royal couple refused to let their celebrity go to their heads. The level of adulation, you wouldn't believe it, Philip recalled. It could have been corroding. It would have been very easy to play to the gallery, but I took a conscious decision not to do that. Safer not to be too popular. You can't fall too far. The Duke of Edinburgh also helped his wife stay on an even keel when she became frustrated after endless hours of making polite conversation. Meeting and greeting thousands of people at receptions and garden parties actually gave her a temporary facial tic. But when she was watching a performance or a parade, and her face was in repose, she looked grumpy, even formidable. As the Queen herself once ruefully acknowledged, the trouble is that, unlike my mother, I don't have a naturally smiley face. From time to time, Philip would jolly his wife. "Don't look so sad, sausage," he said during an event in Sydney. Or he might provoke a grin by reciting scripture at odd moments, once inquiring sotto voce, "What meaneth then this bleating of the sheep?" At Tobruk, in Libya, the Queen and Prince Philip transferred to Britannia, the new, 412-foot royal yacht with a gleaming deep blue hull, which they had designed together with architect Sir Hugh Casson. For its maiden voyage, Britannia took Prince Charles and Princess Anne to be reunited with their parents in early May 1954 for the first time in nearly half a year. The Queen was pleased that she would be seeing her children earlier than she had anticipated, but she worried that they wouldn't know their parents. Still, when the moment came and the Queen was piped aboard, her strict control and conformity to protocol prevailed as it had when she met her son after her Canada trip. "No, not you, dear," she said as she greeted dignitaries first, then shook the 5-year-old's extended hand. The private reunion was warm and affectionate as Charles showed his mother all around the yacht, where he had been living for more than a week. The Queen told her mother how happy she was to be with her enchanting children again. "They had both gravely offered us their hands," she wrote, "partly I suppose because they were somewhat overcome by the fact that we were really there and partly because they have met so many new people recently. However, the ice broke very quickly and we have been subjected to a very energetic routine and innumerable questions which have left us gasping." In the autumn of 1957, the royal couple set off for their second trip to the United States, a state visit hosted by the 67-year-old President, Dwight D. Eisenhower, with whom the Queen had an affectionate relationship that dated back to World War II, when he was in London as Supreme Allied Commander. Unlike the Queen's lightning visit in 1951, this would be a full-dress affair, 6 days in Washington, New York, and Jamestown, Virginia, where she would celebrate the 350th anniversary of the founding of the first British colony in America. After a day-long visit to Williamsburg and Jamestown on October 16, the royal couple flew to Washington on Eisenhower's aircraft, the Columbine III, a swift and sleek propeller plane with 4 powerful engines. As they waited to take off, Philip immersed himself in a newspaper while Elizabeth unlocked her monogrammed leather writing case and began writing postcards to her children. "Philip," she suddenly said. Her husband kept reading. "Philip," she repeated. He glanced up, startled. "Which engines do they start first on a big plane like this?" Her husband looked momentarily perplexed. "Come on now," she said with a laugh. "Don't wait until they actually start them, Philip." He offered a guess, which turned out to be correct. They went in sequence, first on one wing from the inner engine to the outer, then the inner followed by the outer on the other wing. "He was flustered," recalled Ruth Buchanan, wife of Wiley T. Buchanan, Jr., Eisenhower's chief of protocol, who sat nearby. It was so like what an ordinary wife would do when her husband wasn't paying attention. Riding into the Capitol with the president and his wife, Mamie, in a bubble-top limousine, accompanied by 16 bands, they were cheered along the route into Washington by more than 1 million people, who were undaunted by intermittent rain showers. The royal couple spent their 4 nights in the most elegant guest quarters in the recently renovated White House, the Rose Suite, furnished in federal style, for the Queen, and the Lincoln bedroom for the Duke of Edinburgh. Much of the visit was given over to the usual receptions, formal dinners at the White House and British Embassy, complete with gold plates flown over from Buckingham Palace, and tours of local sites. It was evident to Ruth Buchanan that the Queen was very certain, and very comfortable in her role. She was very much in control of what she did, although she did laugh at my husband's jokes. Once, when Buchanan was waiting for her husband to escort the royal couple to their limousine, I could hear her guffawing. You didn't realize she had that hearty laugh. But the minute she rounded the corner and saw us, she just straightened up. Vice President Richard Nixon treated the royal couple to a luncheon with 96 guests in the orchid-bedecked old Supreme Court chamber, in the Capitol. Elizabeth had specifically asked to see an American football match, so the White House arranged for her to sit in a royal box at the 50-yard line at the University of Maryland's Byrd Stadium for a game against the University of North Carolina. On the way she spotted a giant supermarket and asked if a visit might be arranged so she could see how American housewives shop for food. To the cheers of 43,000 spectators, the Queen walked onto the field to chat with two opposing players. Dressed in a $15,000 mink coat given to her by the Mutation Mink Breeders Association, a group of American fur farmers, she watched the game intently but seemed perturbed whenever the players threw blocks. While the royal pair was being entertained at halftime, security men raced back to the supermarket to arrange for a royal visit on the fly. After Maryland's 21-7 victory, the motorcade arrived at the Queenstown shopping center at 5 p.m., to the amazement of hundreds of shoppers. Elizabeth and Philip had never before seen a supermarket, a phenomenon then unknown in Britain. With the curiosity of anthropologists and an informality they had not displayed publicly in Britain, they spent 15 minutes shaking hands, quizzing customers, and inspecting the contents of shopping carts. "How nice that you can bring your children along," said Elizabeth, nodding toward the little seat in one housewife's cart. She took a particular interest in frozen chicken pot pies, while Philip nibbled on sample crackers with cheese and joked, "Good for mice." An exuberant welcome awaited them in New York City. The Queen had asked specifically to see Manhattan as it should be approached, from the water, a vista she had been dreaming about since childhood. "Oui," she exclaimed as she caught her first glimpse of the lower Manhattan skyline from the deck of a U.S. Army ferry boat. A crowd of 1.25 million lined the streets from Battery Park to City Hall and northward to the Waldorf Astoria for their ticker tape parade. She had only 15 hours in the city to fulfill her wish list and shake some 3,000 hands. Wearing a dark blue satin cocktail dress and close-fitting pink velvet hat, she addressed the representatives of 82 countries at the United Nations General Assembly. At the conclusion of her 6-minute speech, the audience of 2,000 responded with a thunderous standing ovation. During a reception with delegates, Philip talked to Soviet Ambassador Andrei Gromyko about the recently launched Sputnik satellite. The royal couple were feted at 2 meals at the Waldorf, a luncheon for 1,700 hosted by Mayor Robert Wagner and a dinner for 4,500 given by the English-speaking Union and the Pilgrims of the United States. In between, the Queen took in the tremendous view from the 102nd floor of the Empire State Building at twilight. Another specific request. As the white tie banquet began, in the grand ballroom, the punishing schedule was beginning to take its toll, even on an energetic 31-year-old Queen. The New York Times noted that her speech was the one time during the program, when the fatigue showed through. She made no effort to force a smile, and although she stumbled over her text only once, her voice plainly showed it. Her final stop that night was a Royal Commonwealth Ball for another 4,500 guests at the 7th Regiment Armory, on Park Avenue. One aviator blinded in World War I tried to get up from his wheelchair to greet her. She put a gentle hand on his shoulder and told him that he should not rise, recalled Wiley Buchanan. She spoke to him for several moments, then moved on. "You both have captivated the people of our country by your charm and graciousness," Eisenhower wrote in his farewell letter to the royal couple. "Happy ever since." After a hiatus of 6 years, the 31-year-old monarch was keen to have more children, as was her husband. Dickie Mountbatten blamed the delay on Philip's anger over the Queen's rejection of his family name after the accession. But by her own account, she had postponed her dream of having a large family primarily because she wanted to concentrate on establishing herself as an effective monarch. During a visit to Buckingham Palace in 1957, Eleanor Roosevelt met with Elizabeth for nearly an hour the day after Prince Charles had undergone a tonsillectomy. The former First Lady found her to be just as calm and composed as if she did not have a very unhappy little boy on her mind. Elizabeth reported that Charles had already been fed ice cream to soothe his painful throat, yet it was 6:30 in the evening, and she was compelled to entertain the widow of a former U.S. president rather than sit at the bedside of her 8-year-old son. While the Queen certainly loved her children, she had fallen into professional habits that kept her apart from them much of the time. They benefited from nurturing nannies and a doting grandmother. But because of her dogged devotion to duty, amplified by her natural inhibitions and aversion to confrontation, Elizabeth had missed out on many maternal challenges as well as satisfactions. In May 1959, after Philip's return from a 4-month goodwill tour aboard Britannia, Elizabeth got pregnant at last. Once she hit the 6-month mark, she withdrew from her official duties. But one bit of unfinished business needed to be resolved. When Prime Minister Harold Macmillan visited her at Sandringham in early January 1960, she told him that she needed to revisit the issue of her family name, which had been irritating her husband since she decided in 1952 to use Windsor rather than Mountbatten. The Queen only wishes, properly enough, to do something to please her husband with whom she is desperately in love, the Prime Minister wrote in his diary. What upsets me, is the Prince's almost brutal attitude to the Queen over all this. Somewhat cryptically he added, I shall never forget what she said to me that Sunday night at Sandringham. Macmillan left shortly afterward for a trip to Africa, leaving the resolution of the Queen's tricky family problem to Rab Butler, his deputy Prime Minister, and Lord Kilmuir, who served as the government's legal arbiter as the Lord Chancellor. Butler sent a telegram to Macmillan in Johannesburg on January 27, saying that the Queen had absolutely set her heart on making a change for Philip's sake. By one account, Butler confided to a friend that Elizabeth had been in tears. Following discussions among her private secretaries and government ministers, a formula emerged in which the royal family would continue to be called the House and Family of Windsor, but the Queen's royalist descendants starting with any grandchildren who lacked the designation of Royal Highness would adopt the surname Mountbatten-Windsor. Those in the immediate line of succession, including all of the Queen's children, would continue to be called Windsor. It seemed clear-cut, but 13 years later Princess Anne, at the urging of Dickie and Prince Charles, would contravene the policy on her wedding day by signing the marriage register as Mountbatten-Windsor. Elizabeth announced the compromise in a statement on February 8, 1960, saying, "The Queen has had this in mind for a long time and it is close to her heart." On February 19, at 33, she gave birth to her second son. In a gesture of wifely devotion, Elizabeth named the boy Andrew, after the father Philip had lost 15 years earlier.